It's the scene in which Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet meet again at Pemberley. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. At this moment, the narrative stops in its tracks, just like Mr. Darcy absolutely started in this beautiful phrase by Jane Austen. And only slowly does he recover composure, and only slowly does the narrative begin to regain speed, to regain traction. And from this moment on, we're also on a trajectory towards the happy ending of the story. This meeting between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy actually shouldn't be that much of a surprise because, I mean, on the face of it, it's not that unlikely that you meet the owner of Pemberley in his house. And yet, Jane Austen has built it up as the main surprising coincidence in her entire novel. And she has done this by providing a very particular build-up of two types of probability and pacing them accordingly. Elizabeth is on a trip with her uncle and aunt through Derbyshire, and she does that because she had received a proposal of marriage from Mr. Darcy, but had turned him down. So that trip is a way of distracting her from that event. But of course, Pemberley is one of the finest houses in Derbyshire, so her uncle and aunt absolutely want to go. And there is a long discussion about that, where on the one hand, the uncle and aunt talk about their tourist enterprise, and at the same time, we get a view of Elizabeth's mind of how she really doesn't want to go because, as we hear, it would be dreadful. At the same time, of course, by the mention of Pemberley, the first thing that comes into her mind is Mr. Darcy. So we've got a sort of double track of probabilities going on. On the one hand, the epistemic probability question of, is it likely that Mr. Darcy will be met there or not? And on the other hand, the sort of emotional probability, do we want to meet him or not? And those, of course, are two different things and develop on parallel tracks across the entire book. Here, the discussion goes towards lowering the epistemic probability that they will meet Mr. Darcy because they are told that Mr. Darcy is in London, he's not likely to return anytime soon. The housekeeper will give you a tour, and hence Elizabeth agrees to go along. But at the same time, we also have this emotional probability where on the one hand, she wants to meet him, on the other hand, she doesn't really. This discussion takes place actually several chapters before the encounter. And in fact, it takes place in a different part of the book because Pride and Prejudice was published in 2 volumes. So today you buy Pride and Prejudice, it's a single paperback. But if you bought it at the beginning of the 19th century, it would be in 2 volumes in 2 parts. And this discussion of whether to go to Pemberley or not, establishing exactly that dynamic between is it likely and do I want it to be likely, is at the end of part 1. Indeed, the discussion ends with this famous summary sentence of the narrator, to Pemberley, therefore they were to go. So what we get here is a build-up of probabilities, and that works through the pacing of how readers are given different kinds of information, playing both in their construction of the story world and the plot, and in their emotional assessment of it. The whole thing, I've discussed this in my book, Probability Design, can be mapped across multiple scales of cognition. So probability designs is an attempt to look at literature from predictive processing. And here the idea is that we constantly have expectations and predictions, and that's how we approach the world. And the world keeps correcting us through the sensory flow of empirically new information. So predictions and prediction errors enter a feedback loop that run across multiple levels, there are cascades of feedback loops from very basic embodied cognition to more abstract, conceptual, abstract, propositional modes of thinking, and they feed up and down along this cascade of feedback loops. At the same time, as I hope the case of Jane Austen has shown, this also unfolds if we think about pacing across multiple time windows. So first of all, there is the story world, what happens in the fiction, which has beginnings and endings of events. The second level to consider is the level of the discourse, so the discourse of the narrator, but also how the text is presented to us in material form. What are the chapter breaks? Is it 2 volumes? Is it just 1 paperback, etc.? Can it be read in one sitting? A text, prose text that can be read in one sitting is defined by Edgar Allan Poe as a short story. That's the sort of unit, the reader's capacity to read it in one go. Of course, for most prose narratives that we consume, that doesn't apply. The novel always needs to be read across multiple sittings, which creates, again, a time window. And finally, how this builds up towards an overall probability design, an overall understanding of the narrative as a whole. I would have gone now into a long discussion on predictive processing, but Sarah reminded me last night that I only have 35 minutes, so I'll skip that, but feel free to ask later on. I'll skip that and turn to the question of how we move up and down these scales of cognition. And I'll move from Mr. Darcy absolutely starting at Pemberley to the ballrooms of St. Petersburg and Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. This is relatively early in the novel before the main action gets going, and it is centered around Kitty, who is a debutante, and actually expects Vronsky, this dashing officer who will start an affair with Anna Karenina. She expects him to ask her for a dance. So here she enters the ballroom at the beginning of the chapter. Korzunsky saw Kitty entering, made a beeline for her in that relaxed saunter, which is the preserve of ball directors, bowed and held out his arm so he could clasp her slender waist without even asking for her consent. She looked around for someone to whom she could hand her fan, and the hostess took it from her with a smile. Here, every prediction that is made is instantly confirmed. The environment gives no resistance whatsoever. Everything runs very smoothly. Kitty looks around for someone to take her fan, and the hostess takes it from her with a smile. And that smoothness of development then continues over into the physical movement as they start dancing. She bent her left arm in order to place it on his shoulder, and her little feet in their pink slippers began moving quickly, lightly, and evenly in time to the music across the slippery parquet. What we have here, I would argue, is a designed sensory flow that feeds into our embodied meaning-making processes, creating exactly that impression of flow through resonances in the reader's body. This is the last predictive processing thing. I think this sensory flow in a literary text has a particular quality that is worth considering when we talk about what readers do with their bodies. This is a quotation from Andy Clark's Surfing Uncertainty, his book outlining a theoretical philosophical model for predictive processing. And he's mostly focused on real world environments where we actually have a material space around us that can give us sensory input. In this citation, he talks about imagination and dreaming, saying that for such systems command a generative model capable of reconstructing the sensory signal using knowledge about interacting causes in the world. That process of reconstruction, tuned and deployed in the presence of the sensory signal, paves the way for processes of outright construction, able to form and evolve in the absence of the usual sensory flow. So in imagination and dreaming, we do not have the sensory input, but we have a generative model that we have used in physical real world environments and movement that we can then, from which then a sensory flow is generated that is entirely virtual. I would say for the case of reading literature, it's somewhere in between that. It's not construction, because we do have a sensory flow. We've got the words on the page that we're following. And these words on the page are not coincidental. They have been put there and designed and reshaped. And part of what I think my job as a literary scholar is, it's exactly to work out what that design is and how it functions together. So Kitty in the ballroom, I think, is a good example of how embodied aspects of language are used to create a particular impression of smoothness and flow. And Tolstoy continues this immediately. "One relaxes waltzing with you," he, Korzeniowski, said to her as they launched into the first slow steps of the waltz. So you can see how the rhythm implied in the language actually mimics the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 rhythm of the waltz that the characters are dancing, at least in this translation by Constance Garnett. "Your lightness and precision are sheer delight." So now it moves over into the direct speech of the character, he told her, which is what he said to almost all his close acquaintances. And at this point, the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 rhythm that has been established breaks. And with that break in the embodied flow, we also get a different perspective. What appears to be a perfectly coordinated experience turns out to be actually something that is very much rehearsed and does not in any way express a genuine attitude on the part of Korzeniowski. So we have a shift in how the narrator presents and approaches that, along with a shift in the rhythm of the prose. We can think of the progress of a reader through a text in terms of what Csikszentmihalyi calls the flow channel, that the embodied engagement begins at a relatively moderate level of complexity, because if it's too difficult, you're up in the anxiety area, and then progresses towards greater complexity, because otherwise, if you keep at the same level of difficulty, you shift over into boredom. And I think the Tolstoy sequence illustrates very nicely how complexity is ramped up along these different embodied engagements of Kitty in the ballroom. Towards the end, however, Tolstoy uses the opportunity to throw us out of that flow channel. This is about 2 chapters later, when Vronsky still hasn't asked Kitty to dance. Kitty looked admiringly at Anna waltzing as she listened to him, that's Vronsky. She was expecting him to invite her for the waltz, but he did not, and she glanced at him with surprise. He blushed and hurriedly invited her to waltz, but barely had he put his arm around her slender waist and taken the first step, when the music abruptly stopped. So everything that had been going well, everything that had been going smoothly in the first encounter, is now going poorly and is interrupted, and any kind of movement is hindered until also the music suddenly stops. Kitty looked at his face, which was such a short distance from her, and years later, that look full of love which she gave him and which he did not reciprocate would still tear at her heart with an agonizing sense of shame. Here we get some massive temporal and spatial perspective shifts. Not only does the music and the flow stop, suddenly the narrator throws us forwards years later, several years in the future from this highly immersive scene. And there is also a spatial shift because Kitty is looking at his face. So you would expect, taking her point of view, to see what Vronsky's facial expression is. But what we actually get is what she looks like. So we also have a spatial shift in perspective here. So Tolstoy intensifies here that little shift in perspective that we've seen in the earlier scene and gets us, I think, well into anxiety area if we use the terminology of Csikszentmihalyi. And of course, the effect of that is to also give readers a sense of that agonizing sense of shame that Kitty is experiencing. So if we think about pacing the reader's imaginations, so far, I think there are at least two levels of contrast that we need to consider. One is represented movement, how do characters move in the fictional world, as opposed to, or in dialogue with, the temporal control of the narrator. And also, in a way, how this is packaged materially. So here, the chapter or the part ending in Jane Austen would be an example. A second set of oppositions is the sense of flow that is developed in reading, as opposed to temporal and spatial shifts generated by, again, the act of narration. Now, the question is, how do these communicate with one another? And I would suggest that the answer to that question is through plot, and in particular through what I would call plot speed. That is the rate at which the narrative develops or moves along its trajectory. I've started thinking about plot speed in response to an entry on the website TV Tropes, and in particular this quotation from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Television series, which says that according to the computer, it should take us exactly one episode to reach our destination. So the idea that the movement at which the characters get through the fictional world at that speed needs to be exactly the same as the length of the episode, as the speed of the discourse. Now, it's kind of trivial to say that, but it must work for most of the narratives. And most narratives, of course, need to find a way to make this a good deal more interesting than a mere mapping of the speed in the story world onto the speed of the discourse. And indeed, I think most narratives do make this a good deal more interesting. My example are the Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. And I'll start by talking about the chapter where D'Artagnan has just lost his letter of recommendation, and because Rochefort has stolen it. So he's running through Paris to find Rochefort and get his letter back so that he can go to Monsieur de Tréville and become a musketeer. And as he's running through Paris, he bumps into a man who has a bandaged shoulder. D'Artagnan tries to apologize, saying, terribly sorry, I'm in a rush, but the man will have none of it because he's wounded there and it really hurts. And by the way, he's Athos and he challenges him to a duel. D'Artagnan says, okay, fine, we'll meet, and carries on. As he turns around the corner, he runs into a baldric and damages it. And that baldric happens to belong to Porthos, which gives him a second duel, which he agrees an hour later from the previous one. Then, in the next encounter, he comes across a man who discreetly drops a handkerchief to hide it from view. D'Artagnan doesn't quite understand what's going on and thinks he's doing the right thing if he picks it up and hands it back. Except, of course, that greatly puts Aramis and his lady friend at a certain social disadvantage, which forces Aramis to challenge him to the third duel. So in this chapter called The Shoulder of Athos, the Baldric of Porthos, and the Handkerchief of Aramis, we have 3 duels in very quick succession, or 3 encounters, which suggests that the story world speed is going very fast. Time and movement, D'Artagnan is running through these encounters. He doesn't even manage to finish his dialogues in some instances. But if we look at the plot speed, this is actually not matched by the same sense of acceleration, because what D'Artagnan wants is to become a musketeer. That has become less likely after losing the letter of recommendation, but it's become massively less likely after agreeing to 3 duels with 3 highly trained fighters. And even if he should survive all 3 duels, he would have killed 3 members of the corps of the Musketeers, of whom he wants to become a member himself. So in the way in which the plot speed and the story world speed are correlated, we have a very strong sense of deceleration, actually, even though D'Artagnan is going very fast. All of that changes when they actually meet up for the duel, and they all meet there at the same time because, of course, Porthos and Aramis are the seconds for Athos, so they figure out what's been going on very quickly. But before they can enter into a conversation about this, the guards of the cardinal show up in order to arrest the musketeers for illegal dueling. And this is the moment when everything changes. This single moment was enough for D'Artagnan to take sides. It's one of these events which decide the life of a man. Monsieur, said he, let me correct, if I may, something that you have said. You have said that you were only 3, but to me it seems that we are 4. And in this move from you are 3 to we are 4, he does become, to all intents and purposes, a member of the Musketeers. So in that moment, we have the plot speed leaping forward very quickly and the strong effect of acceleration. And that dynamic is constantly going on in the Dumas novel. Very quickly, Dumas actually ripped the first half of the Three Musketeers from this 18th century novel, the Memoirs de Monsieur d'Artagnan. And the beginning can be very closely mapped onto the Three Musketeers. We have the encounters with them and also the fight with the cardinal's guards. But what is going on here is that he first runs into Porthos, who then introduces him to his friends in taking a walk through Paris and talking about who they are and what they're doing. And then he also walks him to the place where the cardinal's guards are already waiting. So here the story world speed and the plot speed are sort of coordinated one-to-one, which I think by now is quite unusual in novels. Now we've gotten used to an acceleration-deceleration dynamic, but it can, in some instances, also be mapped one-to-one. So we've got story world speed and plot speed and a way of relating the physical aspects of the experience of moving through a narrative to a more conceptual aspect, to a sense of where we are in the progress of events. There's a third speed, the speed of discourse, that is the time it takes to read the passage, which is of course determined by the way in which it is narrated. So that links to what I've said about temporal control of the narrator, and also the way in which it is parceled up into chapters. And here again, the Three Musketeers are a really interesting case study because they were originally published in serialization in the journal Le Siècle. And even more so, they were actually not written by Alexandre Dumas alone. He was collaborating with a dramatist called Auguste Maquet. And in the manuscripts, you can see who did what and how did they coordinate and collaborate with one another. And what is, because they lived in different parts of Paris, they also had to communicate through the evening and the morning post system. So one can actually also trace to some extent the pacing of the collaboration here and link it to the publishing schedule of the journal. Unfortunately, I can't go further into that. But I think there's an interesting way in which also discourse speed can be linked to the question of how things are made. So at this point, we then have a way of thinking about how the movement and temporal control in narration, flow, and the perspective shifts can be related through the backbone of the plot that runs through the entire narrative. Now, the question of how is, of course, how do all of these things relate to one another, these different time windows? It seems to me quite obvious that multiple speeds are at play in reading. I've discussed this or begun to discuss this in an article called Reading Fast and Slow, where I took issue with the idea that reading is a slow experience, as it's quite often presented as an opposite to digital reading, which always needs to go fast. Reading on paper, and especially reading literature, is something which must be slow. The sort of origin text of that assumption is Sven Birkert's Gutenberg Elegies, and you can see it's already there for 25 years. But to me, it seems reading it doesn't feel that slow. At least most of the time, I do feel I'm moving quite fast through the pages, even though I'm not measuring how many pages per hour I make, so to speak. So there is something more obviously going on, and looking into reading research, which, I mean, this is quite rudimentary, drawing on Marianne Wolf. It indeed suggests that the multiple processes involved in reading unfold across different time horizons. So recognizing a word, understanding what it means, getting a sense of its phonetic qualities, all of that it emerges at different moments. So this is mapped from left to right, different moments in the reading process. And then there is a big break up to what she calls semantic and comprehension processes, which would include understanding from which perspective, which focalization a passage is narrated, which would also include developing metaphors, for example, across longer sections of the text, etc. All of that takes a much longer time to, let's say, mature in the reader's experience. So quite clearly, not all of that can be condensed to one single moment in time. In order to illustrate that, I introduce a final fourth example, The Queen of Spades by Alexander Pushkin. You maybe know the story. It's the story of a young student who wants to make his fortune at the gambling table. He gets the secret of the 3 winning cards, which are the 3, the 7, and the ace, in case you were wondering, by scaring an old lady to death who has this secret from the magician Cagliostro. Here we are in the final scene at the gambling table. Hermann, it's the name of the student, has staked everything he has on this single hand. We see how high the stakes are. We have a queen and an ace. My ace wins, says Hermann, turning over the card. So he already expects to win as he turns over the card. But it turns out this is a big, he is very much mistaken. Your queen is lost. He doesn't get the ace, he gets the queen. And that queen then, we get this passage where we sort of move into his head. That queen then reminds him of the old woman who died because he wanted the secret cards. Now that seems to be a moment that is quite surprising, but actually it's not so much, because this has been built up again before by Pushkin. On the way to the gambling table, Hermann keeps mulling over these cards and starts perceiving the world around him in those terms. And we read that 2 idées fixes cannot coexist in the moral sphere, just as 2 bodies cannot occupy the same space in the physical world. The image of the dead old woman was soon eclipsed in Hermann's imagination by the 3, the 7, and the ace. So it basically takes over his entire perception. The 3, 7, and ace were always in his thoughts and on his lips. Seeing a young woman, he would come out with, "She's so slender," a real 3 of hearts. When asked the time, he might reply, 5 minutes to the 7. A pot-bellied man always made him think of an ace. So it becomes almost automatic, the way in which he runs through that sequence of cards. So it's not so surprising that he thinks he has an ace, even though what is in front of him is the Queen of Spades. However, when you finished the short story and you go back to the beginning, you start reading it again, you realize that this isn't just Hermann's manic perception. Pushkin has set up throughout the story patterns of 3, 7, and an ace, or something very desirable throughout. I give 2 examples here. One is in the very beginning, where Hermann is introduced, where he says calculation, moderation, and hard work. He comes from good German stock. Those are my 3 sure cards. They are what will treble my capital, increase it 7-fold, and win me peace and independence. Then later on, when the old woman, the countess, is introduced, we see that she has 3 maids standing around her. She dresses in the fashions of the 70s, and there is the young lady, her ward. So the 3 and the 7 remain constant, and what would be the ace, what would be the trump card, is constantly shifted out. In the beginning, Hermann thinks his trump card would be peace and independence. That's his goal. Then he encounters this young lady, Eliza, And she becomes his access to the old countess. He seduces her and leaves her. So what we have here is, of course, a temporal progression, as I've been discussing it elsewhere, with a plot that leads us to the gambling table and the question of whether Haman will make his fortune with this winning sequence of cards. But at the same time, we also come to realize that actually all of this is quite fixed. There isn't actually a real development forward. It's always the 3, the 7, and the ace. And it's the ace that continues to be shifted out. So the fact that the ace that Haman expects at the end is shifted out with the queen has already been set up throughout by Pushkin. So here the pacing actually leads to a kind of iteration, a repetitive pattern, kind of like having cards on a gambling table that you just keep turning around. So if we think of pacing also in terms of the overall probability design, we come to see certain patterns that are not necessarily linear, but that create overall compositions, configurations of meaning. So if we want to look at pacing the reader's imagination, I would suggest that it's perhaps a good idea to imagine this more like a musical score, where different lines of pacing happen at the same time. So the embodied movement of the characters versus temporal control, the sense of flow versus perspective shifts, or indeed the pace at which the plot progresses through the narrative. All of these would have to be linked to the cascades of expectation and the input from the designed sensory flow that shapes it. That is, of course, partly also an empirical question. And as I hope to have shown, the question of how we pace reading cannot be solved on the level of how fast readers move through the narrative on a merely physical measure, because you can go very quickly through a narrative and have the feeling that it's moving very slow. Or you can take your time reading a story, but have the phenomenological experience that this is very fast paced. And I think a lot of that depends exactly on that dynamic of plot speed that I have been talking about with the Three Musketeers. So one would also have to look at how is this experienced by readers. One would have to combine physiological measures of reading speed with a phenomenological investigation that then I think also needs to be linked exactly to the moments in the textual probability design, precisely because it's not just a linear progression that is at stake here, but also an overall construction of a narrative within a designed sensory flow. Thank you.
I think now we have a Q&A, and we have 15 minutes. Thanks.
There are microphones there.
Okay, sorry. So thanks a lot for your talk. I just have one question, given that you also wanted to, if possible, come back to the predictive coding in the Q&A. So you referenced Clark and also pointed to him as somebody who has kind of explored some of the philosophical underpinnings of the model. And I just wanted to ask you that, I mean, as you probably know, there are quite some disagreement about how exactly to interpret those philosophical underpinnings. And there are a number of people, including Bovee, Seth, Friss, who have all tried to link predictive coding to a very strong form of internalism and neurorepresentationalism, and who talks about predictive coding as basically evoking this idea that we are living in a wakeful dream or controlled hallucination, and that predictive coding is has basically shown 4E cognition to be completely wrong. And so I'm just curious to know whether you're kind of buying into that model, or you really want to take predictive coding in a very different direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I refer a lot to Andy Clark's work, because he tries to have it both ways. And I think predictive processing is a way of doing that. because it does depend on, input from the environment along which you shape your predictions. So your sense of probability is constantly plugged in, I would say, to the environment in which you move. So for me, but of course I come out of a 4E way of thinking, it is actually quite difficult to follow Howie and Tristan and others into the sort of mental delusion kind of world. I think one of the problems, of course, I have with text is that there is already some kind of representation. But as I hope to have shown with this idea of a design sensory flow, yes, it is representation, but it is representation that, again, gives you a sensory input that you constantly develop and that constantly runs through the reader's body as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's fine. Thanks.
Anyone? Just hang on to the microphone that's one.
Well, I say thank you as well. I had a question, this processing of different temporalities. Do you think this is tied to reading silently with writing on paper? I've been discussing with people working with audiobooks how this change composition of text.
That is a very good question. I think there is something about the poverty of the stimulus in the written text that allows you to do more with it as a reader. That could include reading it aloud. I don't think that is particularly tied to reading silently. And there is, of course, also the phenomenon that you do have sort of auditory mental imagery. You do hear voices when you're reading, or you get a sense of an auditory sense, for example, in the ballroom description. Even if it's not very precise, there is a kind of, auditory scenery, I would say. So I would maintain that what I say is tied to the written text. Because it seems to me in the audiobook, exactly because you have a richer stimulus, you have less freedom just very simply, the pace is dictated by how quickly it's read. So you can't skim and skip and go back as easily as you can in a written book.
Maybe I'm allowed to ask a question myself. Very intriguing talk. When you talk about the reader, on that two readers at least. So there's the reader, that's a kind of implicit reader, that's the one who's being paced by the implicit author, but there's also the empirical reader who is doing the reading. And it seems to me it's not quite clear who this reader is that you're talking about, this abstract reader. Go back to Dan Zahavi's question about Andy Clark. There's this, in Clark's quotation at least, this Kantian framework somehow that you have a sensory flow and then the imagination does the bridging to the sort of conceptualization of what is going on with the sensory data. And that means that you would have, that your imagination would have to be free in the sense that it can't be totally determined by the authorial techniques, for example. So again, who is the reader? Is it the implicit reader that is part of the sort of structure of the text, or is it the reader who is being paced, but does his or her own pacing as well?
Yeah, that is, of course, a very difficult question because it is notoriously hard to locate the implied reader if he or she is not made explicit as a narrative in the text. And I do think that, you know, real readers have a great amount of freedom exactly because the book is such a flexible tool that you can, you know, you can read the end and then go to the beginning, or you can decide to look something up. There is a nice essay by Umberto Eco about the Three Musketeers, where he talks about inferential walkabouts, how he went to actually trace the street names of Paris from the descriptions of the Three Musketeers. I mean, readers are free to do that, and that, I think, will create a very different sense of the scenery that we have in the Three Musketeers from what we get if we just run with D'Artagnan through the text. So I would maintain that empirical readers use the text as a kind of affordance, and they have a great freedom to, decide what it is they're interested in, and that can change from, the first reading to the second reading, etc. And I think that's one of the reasons why reading a book for the second time is such a different experience. So I would maintain that what I can analyze is the design of the text, but exactly analyze it for the ways in which it offers options to readers.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions, one there and one over there. We'll start with you.
Think about space and space along these lines here, and you introduced the notion of traveling at the speed of the thought, right? That this was part of what's going on, and I guess that this is something you do in design since you flow. Along those lines, you could say that there is very little agency for the full reader to begin. In the sense, the thoughts and the author designs both the space and the flow. Now, it's quite common these days among people who are in contact visualization, body movement. They're also concerned about the speed of movement. But they talk about moving at the speed of your attention. It's kind of a very different way to start, where in a sense your agency lies in having the freedom to align whatever attention is doing with whatever movement. So I wonder, in your analysis of text, your analysis of the process, is there any agency left for the reader in there? Or are you bound to be caught up by the speed of the thought and the design of the flow? I guess there should be a space for agency. How would that then go?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do think there is actually a great space for agency. I mean, some of that can be realized in going and reading up on the layout of Paris, or it can be you put the book aside and you decide I'm reading it next year. But even in the reading process itself, I mean, you bring up attention. I would put mind wandering next to that, because I think that's one of the things that we do when we read. We are constantly, on the cusp of mind wandering, on the cusp of relating this to our own memories or imagining our future along with the text. So I think on that level, and that's, I think, where suddenly the physical speed at which you read slows down dramatically, even though it might not feel as if you're moving more slowly. So I think there is quite a lot of freedom for the reader, even if, and I think, just to finish that thought, the fact that this is designed and that it has, paragraph endings, chapter endings, places where you can latch on again after you've mind wandered. So you're not completely thrown out because, I don't know, the audiobook has been running on and you've got no clue where you are. In a written text, especially one that is designed in patterns like these literary texts that I've shown, there are actually anchor points where you can come back in the text and continue, I would say, I mean, this is my own experience, relatively smoothly, without too much loss, too much of a feeling of disruption, let's put it that way.
Thank you, Karin. My question is, what is the specific role of text as opposed to other narratives about it? Many of the features that you name in terms of pacing the reader's imagination, flow versus spatial and temporal perspective shifts, plot speed, represented movement versus temporal control. Those are very abstract descriptions that would apply to cinema, for example, just as well. And I just wonder whether you think reading is unique or special, or, and then maybe even further, whether the physical or the bodily or material aspects of the holding in their hands during the pages actually really do enter into the story. But the only reference you made to that was the counter. When you talk about how fast the experience of reading is, it doesn't depend on how fast you turn the pages. So I'm just curious, this has been coming up on the reading on paper.
Thank you. So this material aspect, I think that also plays in with the end of part 1 in Jane Austen, where the book is at an end. And in fact, in Northanger Abbey, at the beginning of the last chapter, Austen says, the reader will now know from the telltale compression of the pages that we are hastening together in perfect felicity. So here the ending can already be told just by the mere physical fact that the book has only, I don't know, 15 pages left or something like that. I would link that to discourse speed, which sometimes, narrators will draw attention to. Sometimes it's the sheer brute physical fact that there are only so many pages left. I think to come back to the first part of your question about control, I've talked about the narrator's temporal control, but of course, if you compare written texts to cinema or audiobook or any other format where the speed is pre-given, I mean, you can stop a film, etc., but it's not the usual thing to do. We don't do that anywhere near as often as we would stop reading a book or put it down for a moment to get a cup of tea, something like that. So I think if we're interested in pacing and the material aspect and the way in which texts are different from audiovisual media, I think exactly that kind of control that readers have over their temporal exposure is very different from these other media.
I think behind all this talk about pace, I think there's a hidden metaphor of walking. And so everything is being compared to what happens when you're walking along. You just mentioned walking the streets of Paris. And the thing is that when you're walking, you can walk slowly, or if you're in a hurry, you can hurry, you can fasten your steps, but you can't jump. If you want to get from one place to another and there's a certain route, you just have to take that route and go as fast as you can if you're in a hurry, because you're actually inhabiting that surface. But I think that with modern reading habits, both on paper and digitally, you're not inhabiting the surface in that kind of way, and that reading actually makes it possible to have multiple entry points and to jump, hop, like an insect, or like a bird from point A to point B. This is not something that you can do if you're pacing the ground. And I think that points to the fact that the relation to the surface is fundamentally different. So where I see a problem is that we're taking a metaphor from walking and pace of one's feet, where the relation to the surface is of one kind, and importing it into a situation of reading a printed text or a digital text, where the relation to surface is of a quite different kind. And to me, my mind, that makes the metaphor of pace decidedly problematic.
I take your point, but of course this metaphor that the reader is on the journey through the narrative, I mean, that goes back to antiquity. This is not me inventing anything here. And I think it's a quite natural way of thinking about something that is progressing as you also progress through time. I mean, you're engaging with the text, so this is more than just sitting. You are actively doing something. But what I think is interesting about this metaphor is how it gets cashed out in different ways in different literary periods. So I gave this example of Clotilde de Sondras, his Memoir de Monsieur d'Artagnan, where actually plot speed and story speed are sort of one-to-one coordinated, where actually Porthos walks D'Artagnan to all the relevant plot points without a strong sense of acceleration and deceleration. And I think part of the reason for that is that this book, which is 2 volumes and about 300 pages each, doesn't have any chapter breaks. So the leaps that you're talking about are a good deal more difficult to do. Chapter breaks come in the 18th century, and they are to do, I think, with also a change in the attention economy at that time, and becomes particularly virulent with the serialization of Dumas, etc. So I think the walk metaphor, gives the flexibility to handle these different ways of organizing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. I'm interested in something you said about anxiety in relation to Pushkin, and you described shame as the kind of emotion that you experienced for Kitty, I think it was.
Mhm.
Yeah. So is there some sort of connection between the pacing and those sorts of emotional experiences? So in the predictive processing literature, there's an idea that valence of emotion goes with change in the rate of prediction error reduction. So do you have the similar sort of idea that whether you have a negative emotional experience or a positive emotional experience is to do with how the prediction errors are changing in the plot?
Yes. So I think the negative valence here is very much to do with you've got so many prediction errors at so many different levels with the massive shifts in perspective. Yeah, that generates anxieties because you can't resolve them very easily. You have to read that sentence, I think, a couple of times to even understand, the temporal and spatial setup there. So I would fully agree. And I mean, what I said in the beginning about emotional probability and epistemic probability, that is the level at which I would locate exactly that dynamic, that there are constantly multiple. So we know what is likely to happen, but we also know what we want to happen. And they're at the beginning of the story, not the same thing. And it's part of the plot to get us there, that they match if it's a happy ending. So I think that integrates very nicely with the idea of a probability design.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.